On April 26, 1986, the explosion at reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and the subsequent environmental disaster became one of the greatest catastrophes in recent history. The massive nuclear leak raised serious concerns for public health in the region and neighboring countries. It was claimed that the radioactive material released into the atmosphere was 400 times greater than that of the Hiroshima bomb. An area of 155,000 square kilometers was affected, and 52,000 square kilometers of farmland became unusable for decades. In addition, the spread of nuclear fallout across Soviet Russia posed a significant risk of increasing cancer rates. It was a disaster of unimaginable proportions. But behind the globally known Chernobyl incident, there was another event that, had it not been stopped, could have led to even more devastating consequences. The story of 3 men who risked their lives to prevent it. Before starting the video, would you subscribe to the channel and like the video? In the 1970, the Chernobyl power plant was built by the Soviet Union, located 16 kilometers from the city of Chernobyl and near the Belarus-Ukrainian border, to house the plant's workers and their families. A new city named Pripyat was constructed just 3 kilometers from the facility. Pripyat was a typical Soviet-style settlement, complete with numerous kindergartens, schools, sports halls, swimming pools, playgrounds, cafes, and even an iconic amusement park. By 1986, the city's population was around 49,000. On the night of April 25th, a long-postponed test was finally scheduled to be conducted in reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl plant. To understand the reason behind this test, I will first briefly explain how the reactor works in the simplest possible terms. You can think of a nuclear reactor as a factory that generates energy. The fuel used in the Chernobyl plant was a radioactive isotope, uranium-235, located in the reactor's core. As the core undergoes a nuclear reaction, it releases both immense heat and high levels of radiation. This heat causes water to turn into steam, which in turn spins turbines. The energy generated from these spinning turbines is transferred to a generator, where it is converted into electrical energy and stored. During these reactions, control rods are used to regulate the power output and the speed of the reaction. Their main function is to prevent the reactor from producing too much energy, which could cause catastrophic results. In other words, they keep the reaction under control so we don't suddenly find ourselves in the sky. That's the basic and most straightforward explanation of how a reactor works. That night, the experiment they planned to conduct was simple in theory but crucial. The test was meant to simulate what would happen if there was a power outage. Whether the turbines could keep spinning long enough to power the cooling pumps during the critical 30-second window before the backup generators kicked in. This was the small but essential gap that could prevent the reactor core from melting down. But that night, as fate would have it, nothing went according to plan. During the test, the plant's operators lost control of the reactor's power levels. There were some oversights, of course, but I'll keep it simple. When control was lost, the core's temperature rapidly increased. In a desperate attempt to cool the reactor, water was pumped in through the control rods. But instead of reducing the heat, the water quickly turned into superheated steam, causing extreme pressure to build up. The result? A massive explosion inside the reactor, so powerful that it blew the 1,000-ton roof right off. The reactor core was exposed, and an enormous amount of radiation began to leak into the atmosphere. 2 workers on duty died instantly from the blast. Moments later, a second explosion occurred when the water meant to cool the reactor reacted with the fuel rods, causing a fire that would rage uncontrollably. Firefighters and miners were rushed to the scene. But when the local firefighters arrived, they had no idea they were stepping into a deadly environment, already exposed to radiation levels far beyond what their bodies could handle. Meanwhile, the Soviet government, concerned about their reputation, attempted to keep the disaster hidden, both from the world and their own people. Of course, the truth couldn't be hidden for long, but in those crucial early days, many workers at the plant would lose their lives within weeks from the radiation exposure. Thanks to the relentless efforts of the firefighters, the fires caused by the explosion were brought under control in about 6 hours. But the situation remained dire. The real danger wasn't just the fire, it was the reactor core itself. Even as the days passed and May arrived, Reactor 4's core was still melting. The molten radioactive material had turned into a kind of lava, slowly burning its way through the ground. Soviet authorities knew that their top priority was to stop the nuclear leak. Initially, they attempted to contain the disaster from above, hoping to cover the reactor and seal off the radioactive material. But there was one critical detail the authorities had overlooked. Beneath the melting reactor was a massive pool of water, a mixture of the plant's cooling water and the water used by the firefighters to extinguish the flames. Separating the reactor and this water was a thick concrete slab. However, as the core continued to melt, the concrete was slowly being burned through, and the molten radioactive metal was inching closer to the water below. If that molten lava were to reach the water, it would trigger a massive steam explosion. A mega blast powerful enough to destroy not only Reactor 4, but also the other 3 reactors, wiping out the entire plant. This would be a catastrophe beyond imagination, a disaster within a disaster. This part can get a bit confusing. The radiation released from the melting core and the destructive force of the explosion are often mixed up. Without question, Chernobyl produced nearly 400 times more atmospheric radioactivity than the atomic bomb dropped on Japan. Its effects lingered for many years. However, the death toll from Chernobyl was far lower. While the explosion in Nagasaki claimed around 70,000 lives, the direct death toll from the Chernobyl disaster is estimated to be around 4,000. But as I mentioned earlier, the real looming threat wasn't the radiation itself. It was the potential hydrogen explosion that could have occurred if the molten core had come into contact with the underground water pool. That would have been the true catastrophe. According to some calculations, if this explosion had occurred, it would have produced a blast between 3,000 and 5,000 kilotons. That's 140 to 230 times more powerful than the 21 kiloton bomb dropped on Nagasaki. The consequences would have been unimaginable. Most of Ukraine and parts of Europe could have been wiped out. The water supply for 30 million people contaminated with radiation, and life in the region would have ceased to exist for hundreds of years. The question was simple. How could they stop the molten lava from reaching the water pool? The most obvious answer was to drain the pool. To do that, someone needed to reach the water release valves and open them. But there was a catch. The valves were submerged in radioactive water. This wasn't just a dangerous mission. It was potentially lethal. The crisis management team gathered the workers and explained the risks. They made it clear that those who volunteered would most likely succumb to acute radiation syndrome, a fatal condition. However, the government promised that the families of those who took on the task would be taken care of. It was at this moment that the little-known heroes stepped forward. Alexei Ananenko, Valeri Bespalov and Boris Baranov, 3 workers from the plant, volunteered to descend into the flooded foundations, find the release valves, unlock them, drain the water, and, in doing so, save not just Europe, but, in a broader sense, possibly humanity. They were willing to face extreme radiation, knowing death was close at hand. In the simplest terms, they volunteered for a suicide mission. Later, Ananenko would admit in an interview, "I thought about not accepting the mission, but since I was the one who knew where the valves were, how could I refuse?" Ananenko and Bespalov had worked together on the construction and installation of the plant's safety systems. They knew the infrastructure, the layout of the pipes, the location of the main valves, and exactly where to find the release valves to drain the water. The third volunteer, Baranov, would operate the lighting equipment. Under normal conditions, the plant's computers would have automatically handled this process electronically. However, the explosion and the subsequent flooding had knocked out all the electronics. This meant Ananenko and his team would have to do everything manually. The greatest risk of this operation came from the radioactive water itself. Ananenko, Bespalov, and Baranov would be exposed to radiation levels that could bronze their skin in seconds, leave a bitter metallic taste in their mouths, and cause the sensation of thousands of needles piercing their flesh, over 5,000 roentgens per hour. In short, these 3 volunteers were facing a radioactive force that could very well cost them their lives. Engineers had only been able to take measurements from an area above the pool, where the radiation levels weren't catastrophic, but no one had any idea what the radiation levels in the water were like, as even attempting to measure it was too risky. The 3 heroes entered the basement, wading through knee-deep radioactive water in near-pitch-black conditions, dressed in protective diving suits. The corridor was filled with countless pipes and valves, and the air was stifling, thick with the metallic bite of radiation and the intense heat of the surrounding inferno. They carried 2 dosimeter devices, small radiation detectors. One was held at chest level, while the other was strapped to one of their legs to measure the radiation levels in the water. Halfway through, Baranov watched the results on the monitor with growing concern. Wading through the filthy radioactive water, they pressed on, the metallic smell thickening as they moved deeper. Occasionally, they tried to reduce their contact with the water by climbing over pipes, but the environment was unforgiving. At long last, they reached the valves. To their relief, they were able to open them without much difficulty, allowing the water to drain. The operation was a success. As they made their way out, their fellow workers greeted them with applause. Against all expectations, the trio completed what was thought to be an impossible mission in far less time than anyone had imagined. They remained submerged in the radioactive water, a place so dangerous that radiation levels couldn't even be measured, yet they succeeded. Of course, their story quickly became the stuff of legend. In fact, rumors spread that the three men had died immediately after completing their task, sacrificing themselves for humanity. While the part about their willingness to sacrifice was true, the reality was different. Contrary to popular belief, all three men emerged from the depths alive. Boris Baranov passed away in 2005 due to a heart attack. Valeri Bespalov and Alexei Ananenko, however, are still alive today. Though the trio was exposed to some levels of radiation during their mission, the fact that they completed the task so quickly, combined with the water dampening some of the radiation's effects, prevented them from meeting a tragic fate. The area of their bodies most exposed to the water, their legs, developed dark shadows, referred to as radioactive bronzing. Bespalov later recalled that after finishing their task, they repeatedly washed themselves in the shower. Yet no matter how many times they scrubbed, the dosimeter would still register high levels of radiation. In the end, these brave men did what needed to be done. They saved the people of Ukraine and a large part of Europe from a far worse disaster than the one they endured. Their actions were nothing short of heroic.